Okay. I'm Fred Krantz. I'm director of CIJR. I'd like to welcome you all here to today's community seminar, which is a series we have across the year, which is not usually as well attended as this, but then we don't have as remarkably controversial a figure as we have today. I'm sure will outrage us with his presentation. I would say that I would remember at the end of the talk, lots of questions, great, but you make questions, you don't make statements. To the point, short questions. I'll say a few words about CIJR for those of you who are here for the first time. Do we have an attendance sheet passing around? Do we have an attendance sheet? Rob, would you check on that, please? Please sign in, and above all, give us your name and your email, because email is the way we contact people. So what is CIJR, Canadian Institute for Jewish Research? It is an independent academic, pro-Israel think tank. We are 26 years old. We are supported by the community, usually by individuals, through donations which are tax-free. We exist in order to bring objective analysis about Israel and Jewish world issues directly to the public. We are a peculiar think tank in that we don't speak in the first instance to other academics, we speak to the public. And we do that through a series of publications with which some of you are familiar. The Daily Isranet Briefing, which is now estimated to be reaching 40,000 people around the world. We do it through a wonderful student publication called Dateline Middle East, which is now in its 26th consecutive year. There is no other student publication in North America with that record. We have an online journal called Israzine. We have a weekly French magazine called Communiqué Isranet. We also sponsor a whole series of seminars, conferences, colloquia on Israel-related, Jewish world-related issues. We have a remarkable record. We are highly respected on an international basis. We are as active increasingly in Toronto as we are in Montreal. If you know people in Toronto, please let us have their names. We'll contact them. And if they're in Calgary, we'll even do that as well. We also have just instituted the American Institute for Jewish Research, AIJR, which is functioning in the US and is headquartered in Washington, D.C. So if you are interested in what we do, please give us your names. We'll send you our publications. We'll send you information about talks like today's. And you can even make a donation, which is tax-free, to help further the work of CIJR. Our chairman, board chairman, is here, Jack Kinsler, and he'll say a few words about a remarkable gala conference which is coming up in April. And after that, we'll have an introduction of our wonderful speaker by our international board chairman, Nathan Helberg. Jack.
Thank you. Thank you for just a few words about a major conference, an international conference we're organizing for the end of April. The exact date is the 29th of April. It will take place at the Gilbert Conference Center. It's the first time that we are doing we're taking upon ourselves to organize such a major event, because annually we have evening galas for fundraising. But this year we decided to go further, and it was in response, of course, to what's happening with the BDS movement. And the idea was to fight back by showing all the good things that Israel does. And so we went and got speakers from Israel and from Canada, prominent people. Just to give you a few examples, from Canada, Montreal, for example, we'll have Pierre Boivin, who used to be the president of the Canadien, who is now the CEO of Claridge Investments. Guy Breton, who is the rector of the Université de Montréal. We have actually a Muslim Canadian. He's the president of the University of Waterloo. His name is Feridun Hamdullahpour. He was in Israel and was impressed. He actually wrote about it in an article in the Canadian Jewish News. We have from Israel the chief of the Israeli Space Agency and National Research Council. So we have a whole bunch of very prominent people coming to talk to us throughout the day. So basically the day is structured with a plenary keynote. The lunch keynote, by the way, is going to be the Israeli ambassador to Canada, Mr. Rafael Barak. and there'll be 2 trucks running in parallel in the morning and in the afternoon as well. And there's going to be a closing panel, and then there's an evening gala. Now it's a lot of work. We few people here. We work non-stop on this project, and we need as much help as possible. So the idea is, if you can help us promote this event, create a buzz, tell people, we need sponsors, we need advertisers, we need donors, we need people to buy tickets. And we would like to have a few hundred people for the conference. I would say 200-300 people would be nice to have, and usually we get between 150 to 200 people. And what I have now is a new idea also have in mind, by the way, is because of what's going on campuses with the BDS campaigns, the idea is to try to sponsor students who we want them to go back to campus and be able to stand up to what's going on. So any person that buys, because some people buy tickets that are out of town, will take their ticket and give it to a student to come and listen to all the good things that Israel offers to the world. If it's sponsorships, and there's a whole bunch, all sorts of levels, from bronze all the way to event sponsors, each level gets a different number of tickets. We'll take these tickets and we'll give them to students. The idea is to bring as many students as possible into this conference so that they really feel reassured and more confident when they go back to campuses and have to stand up to the bullies, the BDS bullies. Okay, so that's just in brief. We work, and as I said, in this institute, every day we work with Israeli-related issues and Jewish issues, and always trying to help. So all the support we can get is much appreciated. And thank you very much, and enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
In 1960, John Howard Griffin wanted to understand the black experience in America and undertook medical treatments to change his skin color. He was shocked at the extent of prejudice, oppression, and hardship he went through. In 1974 or 5, I was traveling with Cree Indian friends after spending several months hunting and trapping in the James Bay wilderness. Walking through the lobby of a hotel in Rouen, I was cursed as a maudit sauvage. This was a change, albeit not a refreshing change, from the maudit juif I was used to. In 2014, Ryan Bellerose wanted to understand the Jewish experience and wore a kippah for a week. He was shocked by the glares, by the ignorance, and outright bigotry. He was stunned to be called genocider, Jew baby killer. Griffin's and Bellerose's experiments testify not only to prejudice and ethnic animosity. They speak as well to character, the character of the person doing the experiment. In both cases, they put their own identities to the side, exposing themselves to insults and abuse. But the desire for exposing the truth took priority. Ryan could spend all his considerable energy dwelling on the truth of his own people's struggles against injustice, and certainly Native Americans have their plates full with this, not just with historic injustices, but those of recent generations, and even today. Ryan is uniquely gifted, however, in that he understands the connection between the Balfour Declaration and the Métis Settlements Act, between the Roman exile of the Jews from Israel and the Canadian exile of the Métis from Manitoba. He understands that there is common cause among Indigenous people, whether of Judea or Canada. Not only is Ryan gifted in his understanding, he has a singular talent as a writer and speaker. This is enhanced further by his boundless energy and dedication to the things he considers important. Mr. Bellerose is from Paddle Prairie, Alberta, and has lived in places as diverse as Louisiana and Singapore. He's an experienced hunter and trapper, oil rig worker, high-level security worker, and communications technician. He's a founding member of Calgary United with Israel and Canadians for Accountability. He's an activist with other organizations and causes, such as Idle No More. He visited Israel recently, sponsored by Stand With Us. From Montreal, he's headed to Los Angeles to participate in a conference to combat the BS of BDS. Israel is fortunate to have a friend like Ryan Bellerose, and we are fortunate to have him here to speak to us today. Mr. Bellerose.
I always, I don't know, sorry, I get embarrassed. And where I'm from, we don't really, like when other people say nice things about you, you always kind of look at them like, okay, when's the other shoe going to drop? So, but I really appreciate it, Nathan. That was, okay, so one of the things that I try to talk about, because I think it's really important, is the fact that as advocates, we're, especially for the two causes, well, it's really one cause, but for the people that what they think is two causes, we tend to think that we have to be apologetic, and that we have to kind of do this a little bit under the table, so to speak. And one of the things that I'm trying to teach, especially our younger people that are advocating for our causes, is that you don't need to be apologetic for winning. And unfortunately, for some reason, Jews especially, you guys are kind of taught, no, don't celebrate the fact that you won, right? But the problem with that is that it makes it difficult to use you as an example. And it's really important for Indigenous people to see an Indigenous people that have actually won, because we don't have that a lot, right? So one of the things that I try to teach the younger Jewish people that I work with is that it's really important to celebrate the victory, right? So when you look at the history, especially of the Jewish people, I mean, you had 2,000 years of an exile. And during that exile, not only did you manage to maintain a coherence as a people, but you actually managed to maintain your traditions, all the things that make you who you are. Now, with my people, I don't know how much, does anybody here actually know about Métis people, like our history or anything? Okay. Wow, that's more than the room usually does. Okay, because generally when I say Métis, a lot of people look at me and they're like, that's people that are part Indian, right? And then they don't really know that there's actually a people, a nation behind that. So with my people, we were exiled, and what happened with us was kind of an unpleasant story, and let's be honest, history is written by the victor. So the victor in this case would be the British colonialist government that became Canada. Now, they won't tell you that they made a deal with us and then broke it, and then we were foolish enough to make a second deal with them, and they broke that deal as well. What happened to us was basically we fought a revolt. And this, in typical fashion, people don't like when you fight back. And I'm sure every single person here that's Jewish understands this. When you fight back, people tend to get really adversarial with you. So we fought back, and we decided that we didn't want to be part of Canada at the time. We wanted to start our own nation. So the Canadian government, after unfortunately they defeated us, and they basically made a deal with us that if we went to Alberta to prevent the expansion of the United States, that they would let us have the land that we settled on. Now, we went to a place called St. Albert. Now, in St. Albert, it's central Alberta. It's just outside of where Edmonton is currently. And my family in particular, there were 3 brothers. So one brother fled south to New York, and there's actually a city there called Bellerose, New York, oddly enough. And then one of the brothers actually tried to stay in the Red River, and there was a big, it was unpleasant. And then the third brother actually moved to St. Albert. Now, when he went to St. Albert, there was a large Métis community. They all went together. They stayed there for about 10 years. Now, so we have to understand it's 2 generations, because a lot of times people think, okay, so Métis people are like Indians. They lived in tents and they roamed around. But that's not how Métis people were. We were actually, I would say I don't like to use the word assimilated, so I use the word integrated a lot. We had integrated basically into a more, I would say, European type culture. So we started living in towns, like we built towns, houses. So these are not people like in the classic traditional sense of Indians where they lived in teepees and roamed around. But the government still saw us that way. So what happened was the government came and they said, okay, now that there's all of a sudden this huge thriving town and there's large farms with agriculture, they saw that this was not just a viable place, but it was a genuinely good place. So the government showed up and they had what's called Métis script. Now, the Métis script, according to the government, and this is something also I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, the Métis script basically was a piece of paper that said, in order for you to become a Canadian citizen, you sign this paper, but in return for signing this paper and becoming a Canadian citizen, we're going to give you some Canadian currency, and you no longer have your land. Basically, it was almost like a surrender document. Now, the other thing people don't remember about these times, and often when I talk about treaties, it's a real tough thing to talk about, because we hold the treaties very sacred. Sorry. So the treaties are, to a white person, they look on a paper and they see a treaty. The treaty says, you surrender your land, period. That's what it says. I mean, It's pretty black and white to anybody that speaks English. But you have to remember that these people didn't speak English. So if I came to you with a piece of paper and I spoke in a foreign language and said, this is what this paper says, and now I just need you to sign it, right? You would look at the paper and you would say, oh, okay, I'm going to trust you because, you know, if I seem like a trustworthy person, you'd sign the paper and you'd walk away. Now, what happened to the native people was the treaties didn't say what those people told them it said. But in our oral tradition, it did. So we still maintain the sacredness of the treaties because to us, they weren't a surrender document, they were a partnership document. So when they came and they positioned the Métis script to Métis people, they said, okay, this is going to be your piece of paper that will say you're a Canadian citizen and you have all the rights and all the obligations of a Canadian citizen. So a lot of Métis families, by the way, still have the original Métis script. They kept it because, you know, they didn't realize what they were signing. Now, what happened after that was the government showed up about 24 hours later after because they went to each house in the community and got people to sign it. They gave them their Canadian currency, and then they left. Now, we didn't use Canadian currency in the town of St. Albert. It wasn't, you know, we didn't need money. So all of a sudden they're giving these people Canadian currency. Then the RCMP showed up. And you have to remember that at the time the RCMP was like the army today, right? So the RCMP showed up and said you have 24 hours to load everything that you own into a wagon, and you're allowed to take one wagon. And that's important to remember later on. So you have 24 hours, load up your wagon and leave. Now, people forget that the Métis people weren't like Indians. We weren't a nomadic people anymore. For 2 generations, we'd lived in towns. We'd become farmers. You know, we still hunted the buffalo, which is very like it's integral to our culture. But the men would leave to go hunt, and then they would harvest the buffalo, and then they would come back to the town. That was just the way that they had adapted. Now, the reason that's important because my own family went through this. Basically, most of the families, there were several families that died the first year because they didn't know how to live in the bush anymore. These were town people. They'd forgotten how to hunt. They'd forgotten how to build shelters. So some of them froze the first winter. Luckily enough, several families, including mine, they had maintained good relations with the local actual Indians, like the full-blood Indians that were still living a nomadic lifestyle. And so those people took them in. Now, that meant that some of us survived. Now, if we flash forward just a little bit, what happened after that was for about, this is in the 1860s, by the way. This is not ancient history. This is fairly recent. In about 1930, the government, there was a real push for some reason. All of a sudden, the government grew a conscience. And they realized there was still some surviving Métis people in Alberta, and they called them the road allowance people. And the reason they called them the road allowance people is that the Métis people would live just off the roads, so just off the highways. They would build little communities, and they would live there because they were just far enough away that they figured if the police came, they could run away into the bush, but they were close enough to the roads so that they could still maintain some semblance of an existence. So for 2 generations, there were no schools, there was no actual commerce. I mean, these people were literally living, I would say, a combination almost like white people because they had houses. They didn't live in teepees anymore, but you know, still not like how you and I would consider a normal life, right? So you have to remember that these are the kinds of things when I was growing up, these are the stories that I was taught. Like my grandparents, my grandmother and my grandfather's an interesting case. But my family, they still maintain a large oral history. So they'll tell stories about, you know, they can remember when my dad and his younger brothers and sisters, when the white people came and actually took them to put them in residential school. Because they decided, oh, these people are living in the bush and there's no schools here. So instead of trying to build a school here, we're just going to take all these kids and move them about 500 miles and they can go to school there. So I do understand actually, and I think this is kind of why I understand a little bit. I mean, until I actually go through something, I guess I can't really understand it, but I can kind of see the commonalities between our experience and what happened to Jewish people. Because I believe very firmly that when somebody makes a concerted attempt to destroy your people, it's really a very similar thing, right? So one of the things that I try to teach the younger people especially is when you're advocating, you can't be apologetic about it. Because I mean, if I came to you and said, you know, these are some horrible, horrible things that my people went through, but I said it really quietly and I didn't, you know, and I wasn't very effective in my wording. If I used, you know, academic language that really didn't reach people and so they couldn't understand it, they would walk away thinking, well, I was really too bad, right? But I don't want that. I don't want people to walk away thinking, well, it sucks to be them, and just nothing ever happens. What I would like is for people to say, that's really shitty. Like, and I as a person, as a human being, I don't think that that's the way things should be, and I want to change it. And so when I talk to people about Jewish things, I try to tell them in the same kind of plain language. And I think sometimes that makes people a little bit afraid, because a lot of times Jewish people aren't really, like, no offense, but you guys aren't really very good advocates for yourselves. I mean, what I've seen, yeah, like what I've seen is that generally it's almost like you're embarrassed or apologetic to actually speak up, and I think a large part of that is because people have a tendency to poo-poo everything you've went through. Like, one of the most ridiculous things I see, and I see it online and I see it everywhere that I go when I'm talking about Jewish issues, is people have a tendency to say, well, you guys say anti-Semitism about everything, and to be honest, I'm not going to lie here. Every single time that I've seen somebody say that's anti-Semitic, it was anti-Semitic. Like, there's not really a whole lot of times that I've seen, well, there's no times that I've ever seen somebody say that's anti-Semitic when it actually wasn't. I mean, that's the truth of it. And until recently, I'm not going to lie, I wouldn't have known that, because I decided to, and people laugh about this, I decided to wear a kippah because I was sitting at a barbecue with some friends, and a friend of mine said, I was at the mall the other day, and this guy walked past me and he made a comment about disgusting Jew. And, this is Calgary in Canada. I mean, we're not exactly, anti-Semite central, I thought. So I looked at him and I was like, dude, like, come on now. That seems a little bit, And he's like, no, Ryan, I'm serious. And I was kind of like, okay. So we're visiting, and it kind of was in the back of my head, like, I've gone through some things. Like, when I was in university, I've had people ask me stupid questions like, how come you're not on the Indian student government? And I was like, well, because I'm on the main student government. I was the football team's rep. I was voluntold, so I didn't really have a choice. But I was kind of like, well, why would you expect me to only be on the Indian student government? Like, I don't understand that. Why can't I be on the regular student government like everybody else? And they thought, of course, in their typical, and now I'm going to offend some people, but in their lefty, really hardcore, I'm such a good person way, they're like, oh no, I'm being complimentary. You have your own student government for your own issues. And I'm like, but I'm a student, and I'm part of the commonality. And if I only go in the Indian student government, I'm only ever going to reach Indian people. I don't need to preach to the choir. Indians know we have a shitty deal. I mean, we don't have to explain it to them. So it's literally the same way with my friends. So I was sitting there, and it's really kind of funny because I looked at him and I said, dude, I got to find a kippah. And he's like, why? And I was like, well, it's probably not going to be easy because I have a huge head. I know, like, you guys are laughing, but I have a massive head. Like, I have a double XL helmet, which is I have to get specially made for football. So it's literally, yeah, it's difficult. So that night, as a joke, I went online and I said, does anybody know where I can find a double XL kippah? And this lady, it's actually really funny. This little Jewish lady who follows me on Facebook, she's like, done. That's like, she just typed done, and I was like, I was kind of joking, right? So I didn't want to say that. So then now I'm screwed. Now I got to do it. So she says, she's like, I can have it to you in like 2 days. And I was like, okay. So she sends me this knitted kippah. Now here's the cool part. She didn't know much about Métis people, but she picked the same colors that we use for our flag. Mm-hmm. The exact same colors. It's a different blue and white than you guys use, but it's more of a kind of a darker blue. But it was the exact, it was really hilarious because when my dad saw it, he's like, wow, that lady actually knows about Métis history. And I started laughing. I was like, yeah, apparently, so I put the kippah on in the house, and my roommate, it was really funny because just so you guys know, since I started talking about Israel, a lot of people make the comment because apparently nobody can actually care about Jewish rights unless they're Jewish, right? So my roommate comes home and she sees me trying to figure out how to put it on because the kippah is pretty big and my head's pretty big. So I'm trying to figure out how exactly I'm supposed to wear it. And she walks in and she's like, oh, I knew it. I knew you were going to convert. Yeah. And I was kind of like, yeah, not so much. I'm not really actually converting. I like cheeseburgers. So, me too. Yeah, see? So I was like, okay, I got to figure out how to wear this. And I put the kippah on, and it was funny. So she said, what are you going to do now? I said, well, I said, I guess I could sit around the house and do what I normally do during the day, which is play video games and make fun of people on the internet. Or I could just go to the mall. Because I live, now I'm going to explain something here. I live in a place in Calgary called Marlborough. And it's a fairly ethnic place. And it's a very specific ethnicity that lives in that area. And the mosques and stuff are all really fairly close to where I live. So I figured out what the hell, you know, and I'm sure now that you've seen me, you understand. I'm not a small human being. So generally, people don't tend to come up to me and say retarded stuff, or sorry, I shouldn't use that word, ridiculous stuff. Exactly. So they come up to me, and if they're going to say something, they don't get in my face, they get in my chest, right? So I was kind of like, okay, I'm going to go to the mall. So I walk in the mall, and literally, the very first person, as I walk up, very first person I see, they look at me and they go like this. You know? And I was just kind of like, wow, that didn't take long. So I walk into the main part of the mall. Now this is the funny part, because it wasn't all bad, but my expectation at first was kind of that it was going to be. But the very first person that said something to me was this girl. She was working behind this, like, you know, those water massage thingamajiggies. So she's working there, and she's like, hey, are you Jewish? And I'm just like, oh shit, here we go. So I was like, I didn't really know how to explain it, because I didn't really want to tell her, no, I'm doing a social experiment. So I looked at her and I was like, yeah. And I'm waiting, because, like, you know, I figured if I said no, they'll say something different. So I said, yeah. And she goes, cool. She goes, Shabbat Shalom. and then I look, and she pulls this little chain out, and she had a little Star of David, right? And really pretty girl, by the way. I notice these things. So I stood and talked to her for a couple minutes, and then I went on my way. And I noticed that there was a lot of unpleasant looks. Like, I'm not gonna lie. Sometimes it kind of got to me, because as much as I'm a big guy, sometimes people, you know, directing hatred your way is a little bit unpleasant. So I'm kind of noticing these things, and then I go to the bookstore, and this was kind of the most unpleasant experience part that I had. I'm in the store, and I'm buying a book, and this guy walks by, and he glares at me. And so by this time, I'd kind of had a little bit enough of it, right? So I turn, and I'm like, you have a problem? And he's like, why don't you take that offensive hat off? And so, like, I actually wrote in my article, like, I'm not a very PC guy. So some of the T-shirts I have can be a little bit offensive. And my friends actually think it's funny, and they'll buy me T-shirts from all over the world that are a little bit offensive. Like, I have one that's it's got a lady in a hijab, and it says, thank you for not provoking my uncontrollable lust. You know, like, I have lots of shirts like that. I have another one that says, save the trees, wipe your ass with an owl. You know, like, I've got some T-shirts that I think are offensive, but I wear them sometimes because they're funny, right? But this is a hat. It's a little piece of woolen apparel about this big, and there's nothing on it that says anything. There was nothing on there at all that would be offensive to anybody that has any kind of moral compass. And so I was kind of, you know, I'm not going to lie. Sometimes when somebody makes me mad, I tend to get a little bit aggressive. So I turned to him, and I was like, offensive. And I was like, your face is offensive. And then he looks at me, and then he kind of took a step back, because I think he realized, okay, this could get unpleasant for me. And so I took a step forward. And I said, I'd like you to explain to me why my hat's offensive. I was like, feel free. I'm really interested now. And then he kind of backed up a little bit more. And then I thought he worked there. I'm not gonna lie. I thought he was like one of those, you know, like mall employee types, the mouth breathers. So I walk up a little bit closer, and now I think he finally realizes, okay, this could turn out very unpleasantly for me. So he's like, look, I didn't mean to offend you. And I was like, good. I was like, well, it's too bad though, because you already have. And I was like, this is the part where you turn around and walk away. And he's like, what? And I was like, this is the part where you turn around and walk away. So he turns around and he leaves. Well, the girl that actually worked in the store, she comes walking over, and she goes, what happened? Because she missed it. And like, she was in the back or something getting the book I was looking for. And I just said, you know, some guy said something rude to me, so I just explained the facts of life, and he left. But it really brought home that, you know, as much as I've experienced prejudice, and I have experienced prejudice in my life, this was something that was beyond anything that I would have ever, like, I've had people say dumb stuff about Indians to me. I mean, a lot of times they'll tell Indian jokes in front of me because they don't realize that I'm Native. And I joke about it because, so, this is going to sound really arrogant, but these are my Superman glasses. I take them off, and people realize, oh wait, that guy looks like an Indian. I put them on, white guy. right? And it literally works like that. And my friends even think it's funny. They're like, dude, when you wear your contacts, you actually look like an Indian. And I'm like, awesome. Like, what do you even say to that, right? But it's true, and I accept it, and I'm not overly sensitive about it. But what I realize is now all of a sudden I have a hat, and I put the hat on, and all of a sudden it's like instant Jew. Everybody is like looking at me, and it's funny because the Jewish people even treated me differently. Like, but it's cool because at least they're being real. Like, it's Shabbat Shalom, how you doing? You know, one guy asked me what temple I went to, and so I told him, I'm like, I'm not really Jewish. You know, like I didn't really want. And then he's like, what? And I was like, I'm wearing it just to see how people treat you. And he's like, oh, and he's like, that's kind of stupid, you know. Like, and it was funny because he was honest about it. He was like, you know, he probably thought to himself, why the hell would you want to do that? And then, you know, so I learned a lot from that one little experiment. And it's kind of translated a little more into the advocacy that I do. Originally, when I started advocating for Israel and stuff, I wrote articles, some of them with some very academic-sounding language, like basically the Who is Indigenous article that I wrote. And the reason I wrote that article was really simple. You guys are Indigenous people, and a lot of Jewish people don't understand that. A lot of Jewish people have the same colonized mindset that a lot of Indians have, which is that white is up here and everything else is down here. So when you look at life that way, which is a very colonized way to look at it, you actually start believing that the best thing you can do is try your best to become white. And that's a very, very colonized thing to think. But that's the way that everybody is conditioned to think. And the reason we're conditioned to think that way is simple. When the British took a place over, what they would do is they would install a client ruler. And they did this pretty much everywhere they went. Their client ruler would be an Indigenous person. It would be somebody from the place that they were conquering. But they would teach that person how to kind of rule everything and then get that person to give them money. That's kind of, because this is all about money and resources, really. Now, some people get a little bit offended when I bring this up because there are actually a lot of Jewish people that are very invested because they feel like, okay, I've worked really hard. I've gone through a lot of shit. And in order to become as successful as I have, so I'm really close to here. But what they don't understand is that because you're Jewish, you're no different than Indians. You'll never get to be full white. Like that's only white people can be full white. You can be a step or two below. Now, the interesting part about that is that you might be the only people in the world that I can actually explain this to, that I have a hope of reaching, because you've been up here and you've been in a lot of countries where you are almost the ruler. You are almost at the very top. You're at the apex of society. But you realize how very fragile that is because all of a sudden one day they decide, oh, you know what? Those guys are really rich and they have a lot of stuff. And what's the easiest way for me to get rid of them? Oh, I'll just kill them and take their stuff. And then you realize all of a sudden that no, you're really not white. You're really not at the apex of society. You've been very successful and you've gotten very close, but they won't let you get to the very top. And we've come to realize that as Native people as well. Whenever we started to do really well, people made sure there were concerted efforts to remove that success. There was an experiment in Saskatchewan when they first started the reserve system, where they gave us farming equipment. They taught us modern methods of farming, and this is something you can Google. In southern Saskatchewan, they built farms and they gave us modern industrial farm equipment. This would have been in the early 1900s. The local farmers got upset because the farmers on the res had been given this equipment and had been taught how to farm, and they became very successful. And all of a sudden, they were selling produce at the markets, and they were doing very well. And the local farmers were mad because they were like, well, why is it that these guys were given farm equipment? They were given all of these, steps up, and I mean, they ignored the fact that, hey, you kind of stole all their land in return. But to them, they just saw, okay, well, these guys were given all this stuff, and now they're selling produce, and we can't compete. Well, instead of the government saying, okay, well, what we can do is for the next couple of years, we can help subsidize you guys and make level playing fields for everybody. Instead of doing that, they said, oh, well, we'll just take all the farming equipment away from the Indians. No. So they went to the res, and they took all of the modern farm equipment, and we still have where the guy went, and he actually said this, and this is why it's so offensive to me. You can go back to your traditional methods of farming and still be successful. But I don't know if you guys know this, Indians weren't farmers. We never did that. That's not something, we had no traditional method of farming. There's some tribes that actually do have what we call active agriculture, But most of the tribes practice what's called passive agriculture. And I don't know if you guys understand the terms, but passive agriculture requires that you're nomadic, because what you do is as you're moving along, you would just, maybe I'll leave some mushrooms here. Oh, okay, well, we're at this area. Well, there's a natural place here. I can plant some wild onions and move along. And then the next time that you went in your big circle, you came back and there were mushrooms and onions, right? But that kind of agriculture doesn't work when you're living in one little square. And so these people were kind of like, okay, well, so now what do we do? But they had no concept. So they literally within 10 years, they lost all the knowledge that they had gathered about farming because they didn't have any equipment to do it. And they just stopped farming. And now when you go to southern Saskatchewan, you see reserves that are literally some of the most dire poverty that you'll see in Canada. It's literally, I wouldn't even say third world. It's like fourth world. It's horrible. Some of them don't even have running water, right? So now I'll talk a little bit maybe about the actual advocacy stuff and what we've been doing in Calgary and why it pisses people off. And why a lot of Jewish people actually seem to be on the other side of the fence from us on this. And it's a little bit disturbing to me because I think effective advocacy, like I said earlier, requires you to be proactive and it requires you to be unapologetic. Those are two of the most important things. But some of the other important things, and it's what we forget, we're the good guys, right? And that's that. I can't emphasize that enough. I can't make it more clear than saying we are the good guys. And the reason we're the good guys is because our position is based on things that are moral, ethical, and rational. We don't have to lie. We don't have to show pictures of dead children. We don't have to tweak the emotional heartstrings. We have a position that's based on rationality. And that's full stop. So when I advocate that you're an Indigenous people, it's simple. It's the simplest argument in the world. That's where your people are from. That's where you became a people. That's where the genesis of the Jewish nation happened. All of your traditions, all of your culture, they trace directly back to that place. Now, my people came from a place called the Red River. We became a people in the Red River. Our language, Mishif, developed in the Red River. Our culture and traditions developed in the Red River. That's where we're indigenous to. Now, the argument that we hear, and I'll tell you this right now, I can tell you every single argument that you'll ever hear against the indigenous argument. Oh, well, we all came from Africa. No, we didn't. But that's the argument you'll hear. We didn't become a people in Africa. If there was a dispersal, they call it the dispersal, and human beings went to all these different corners, where did they become peoples? That's where you become indigenous. Now, the reason that this is so important, and I believe it's vital, is their entire narrative. And I use a narrative. When I talk about the Palestinians, they don't have a history. They have a narrative. And that narrative is a story. And that story is that's their land and that's where they've been for thousands of years, right? The part of the story that they don't like to admit is that they conquered that land and they took it away from the people that were already living there. Arameans, Circassians, Jews, these are the people that were already living in this place when in the 7th century they went across the entire Middle East conquering, right? You don't become indigenous through conquering indigenous people. That doesn't happen. If that happened, then you guys would all, well, not you guys because you're Jewish, but white people would be indigenous to Canada because they've conquered us and they've now displaced us and they've replaced us. That's not, if we allow that argument to be made, then we're literally delegitimizing our own rights. And that's why when I do this, it's not strictly on behalf of the Jewish people. And I hope you guys understand that this argument is actually an integral argument for my own people. Because if we start letting Palestinians tell everybody that the Arabs have replaced Jewish people, because that's effectively what they're telling you, is that they conquered the land and they became indigenous, then I have to acknowledge the fact that then white Europeans are now indigenous to Canada. And I refuse to let that argument be made. I'm not saying that they don't have rights. And I'm not one of those native people that advocates that, the whole white people leave and white people go home. I think that's garbage and it would never happen. It's pie in the sky. But what I do believe is that a colonizer people does not have the right to continue to oppress indigenous people in the modern day. That's just not, it's full stop. It's the same thing in the Middle East. I believe the Palestinians have human rights. I believe that the Palestinians have a right to certain things. They do not have a right to the land of Israel. They do not have a right to continue to try and kill and oppress Jewish people. That's not a right. full stop. They don't have the right to do that. But what we've allowed is this idea that they resist, right? And they're resisting an occupation, and that they're the native people. But when you examine the facts, that's patently untrue. So it's important for us to understand that, and it's important for us to understand it deeply enough to be able to negate that argument. Because we have a tendency as pro-Israel advocates to talk about facts all the time. It's all about facts, but we don't use the right facts. So I'm just going to use an example, and actually this is one of the reasons that some of the mainstream organizations really dislike me. Because it's kind of a mean example, and Native people, we tend to use these kinds of examples because they're going to shock you a little bit. They talk about dead kids. It immediately flips an emotional switch. And it doesn't matter if you're like me and you're very educated in it, you realize that they're absolutely full of shit. They're even showing me a picture of Syria. I mean, like, I know this on an intellectual level, I know. But I see the picture and the emotional switch is flipped already. And even though I'm pro-Israel, it immediately flips that switch and it's negative. And I see that, and of course it's negative. Who the hell is going to feel good about seeing a picture of a dead child? So even in the back of my mind, when I know that this is wrong and fake, I still get that emotional switch flip. And now, it's important for people to understand that because I am pro-Israel and I'm fairly educated about this stuff. Now imagine if you're a university student, and I'm not saying all university students are clueless, but you know, large portion of them maybe not as educated as they need to be. They see this picture and they think, oh my God, that's so horrible, which is a natural reaction. And then they think, oh, those terrible Jews, because they're being told this is Jewish people killing these babies, right? Now, they walk away, emotional switch is flipped, and then somebody like me comes along and says, yeah, no, that is horrible, but unfortunately, you know, that's not Jewish people. You know, I don't believe that it's actually that they're the culpable ones in the situation. And then I'll even tell them this picture was taken in Syria, like, you know, because we do that quite often. We'll debunk these things. But the problem is this kid's already had the switch flipped, so now I'm basically on salted ground. I'm trying to plant a seed somewhere that's not fertile. And they'll look at me and they'll say, yes, but the occupation, right? That's the big rebuttal. So then I have to spend 15 or 20 minutes explaining to them about Jewish Indigenous status, and it becomes a very difficult conversation. A lot of times I've even had Jewish kids argue with me, actually most recently in a progressive Zionist group. So yeah, don't even ask me what that means, because Zionism is Zionism, right?
They're not really Zionists.
Exactly. So we have this issue where we're trying to fight, again, now we're being put on the defensive. Because where I try to be proactive, I'm trying to get them to understand the importance of truth and fact, I'm also trying to fight something where they've already had that emotional switch flipped, right? And now, the reason that some of the mainstream organizations don't like when I say this is because they're conditioned already to be on the defensive. All of the organizations, the major mainstream organizations, their forms of advocacy are all very defensive. So they'll talk about dead babies, we'll talk about computer chips. Now, don't get me wrong, I think a lot of the technological innovations in Israel are brilliant. I think that the contributions of Jewish people to the worlds of science, literature, I mean, those are, you know, tiny percentage of human beings making a massive contribution. But when someone's talking about dead babies, talking about computer chips is just going to alienate them. And they're literally going to look at you like, do you have Asperger's? Like why would you think in any world that that's a legitimate argument? I mean, if you're going to talk to techie nerds, like people that have to have the newest iPhone, then absolutely that's a brilliant argument to make. Like the tech sector, you want them to understand that Israel is a vibrant and innovative place. But when you're talking to a student who probably has his mom's old iPhone 3, you know, you don't come to him and say, oh, computer chips, you know. Now, the other reason that this is important is because when we're talking about advocacy, we have to make sure that we understand that it's also important that we know what we're talking about. Because I've seen the damage that somebody who isn't very knowledgeable can do. Now, good intentions, and you know, they come out and they say, you know, like, yeah, you know, I'm pro-Israel, I really support Israel, and Israel needs to be there, and blah, blah, blah. And then someone will ask them a question, and then they'll make a, I want to say a faux pas, but it's just a really bad argument. They'll make a bad argument, and then the other people that are watching this argument see that, and instead of thinking, okay, well, this guy's a bad arguer, they think Israel's wrong, right? And I've seen it very often because some of the people that travel around, and I won't mention any names, but there's a large organization that has a gentleman that goes around teaching people advocacy, and he actually teaches, don't defend the undefendable like the settlements. Now, the reason that kind of, well, I'm just going to be honest, pisses me off, because not only is that an absolutely bullshit thing to say, but he's teaching the next generation of advocates this advocacy, which is not advocacy, which is to do nothing. But more importantly, he's perpetuating something that the other side has literally built in. So I'm not a lawyer, but I took 15 minutes one night, and I found that I was actually researching treaty stuff for Native stuff, and I found that in actual point of fact, and I don't understand why more people don't do this, the settlements aren't illegal. They're not. They're not illegal, and it's patently ridiculous to suggest they are. And yet, I guarantee you, if you go downstairs right now, walk outside, and ask anybody on the street, you know, how do you feel about the settlements in Israel? Oh, they're illegal, right? Why? Because the other side's done a much better job with the PR, and they've got that point of view out to people. They just basically keep telling, what is it? It was Goebbels that said you tell a big lie long enough and people will believe it. Well, that's what they've done. Yeah.
As decided.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing.
To refer to the UN.
Absolutely, and what you know what this is what I say, because that's a brilliant point. The UN might be the most ridiculous body in the history of the world. Like, and as a Native person, this is coming directly like from my community, and we actually contributed to the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People until we realized they don't give a shit about Indigenous people. They talk about it, but I mean they've given $30 billion to the Palestinians, and what have they given to Native people here in Canada? So we've kind of realized that these people, they don't really give a shit about us. They just talk the talk, right? And the thing about the United Nations is, like, and I this is really funny, and well, funny to me, and probably less funny to you because it directly affects you. But in the year when there was an actual genocide in Rwanda, so an actual complete destruction of a population, they censured Israel 13 times. 13 times. Guess how many times they censored Rwanda?
Once.
Not until the very, very end of the genocide, when they actually had to admit it, when the UN had withdrawn completely, and then they said, guys, that was really bad. You know, like how do you even, as a human being who tries to generally live his life by moral principles, how do you even justify that? It's impossible. You can't look at the UN and say, hey, they do a good job. You can't. You look at the UN and you just think to yourself, those guys are idiots. Like, so. But anyway, I mean, so I'll just finish really quickly by telling you about our advocacy efforts in Calgary and some of the challenges that we've had there. So, Calgary United with Israel is a advocacy group, grassroots advocacy group. We started it. Well, Sarah Bernamoff started it, a good friend of mine, a Jewish girl in Calgary, and she's ridiculous. Just so you guys all know, she's this tiny little girl, probably weighs about 100 pounds. She's about 5'3", maybe. I always say she's 5 foot, but she gets upset. And she went to the local federation, the CIJR or whatever they're called, and she told them she wanted to be on their advocacy board, and they said no, there's no room. And so she said, okay, you know, it is what it is. So she goes home and she decides she's going to start her own group. So she goes on Facebook and she puts out an all call to everybody and says, hey, I want to start a group that does actual pro-Israel advocacy. So nobody answered. So it was pretty much just Sarah, kind of, and maybe her mom and her sisters and a couple friends, right? And then one day she read an article that I'd written in I think it was the Montreal paper, the Metropolitan, and it was called Métis and a Zionist, and it's basically just like why I support Jewish rights, right? And it was funny because out of the blue, this girl has no idea who I am, by the way. She sends me an email and she says, I'd like to meet you for lunch and pick your brain. And I was kind of like, I don't really know you. So, and you know,
Too aggressive.
yeah, and I'm pretty stereotypical Métis in this way. I'm not really overly trusting of people I don't know. So I kind of have that, and so I was kind of like, I don't really know you, but you know, if you'd like to get together for a coffee or something, I'm sure we could figure something out. So I meet up with her, and we sit and talk, and she interrogates me for 2 hours. And we joke about it now, but it's true. It was an interrogation. She had a list of questions, and she just literally went through all the questions, and I was waiting for her to shine a light in my face. Like, it was really kind of funny. And then she said, so what do you think we should be doing for advocacy. And I said, well, I'll tell you this. When I was in Idle No More, which was a movement that was strictly about native rights and the environment, and somehow got twisted into an anti-Harper, anti-everything movement, at which point I left, by the way. I told her, I said, what turned for us was actually one of the things that hurt us the most in the end, which was Teresa Spence, this chief, right? Part of the problem was that Spence got us a lot of publicity, but it came at the cost of our credibility. Now, I told her, I said, so the one thing you have to avoid at all costs is the idea that any publicity is good publicity, because it's not. What you need is good publicity, and you need to have publicity that results in an increase in credibility, not a decrease. And she's like, well, what do you mean? So I explained to her about Spence. I was like, she brought us an immense amount of publicity because she went on this hunger strike. And then she cost us all our credibility because, one, she's a corrupt chief and she's inept, and there are people that are trying to remove her constantly from her own band. But two, when you go on a hunger strike, you lose weight. Like, it's really difficult to tell somebody, I'm on a hunger strike. And then you show up like a month later and you're still fat. Like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, and I'm positive that most people noticed it, like, because people would tell me, they'd be like, dude, like, why do you support that woman? And I'm like, I don't support that woman. So, and actually it's funny because in the Native community, people were giving me shit about saying that. They were like, well, don't say that, Ryan. And I'm like, okay, well, two things, guys. One, we should be the ones calling out corrupt chiefs as Native people, right? We should be the ones saying, no, that's not okay. You don't represent us, and we don't want you in the public eye talking like you do. Now here's the correlation with Jewish people. We have people in the Jewish community. I shouldn't say we, but I mean, I pretty much hang out with you guys all the time. But you have these people that travel around purporting to represent Jewish people and Jewish advocacy and pro-Israel. And now I'm sorry I have to do this because I'm going to call this out. There are organizations that claim to be pro-Israel, and they have it in their charter that they are supposed to spend money on being pro-Israel. And part of the problem is, I know for a fact that many of you probably donate to these organizations on the idea that they're pro-Israel and that they'll conduct pro-Israel advocacy and that they'll be active. Advocating doesn't mean hiding under the table. It means speaking up. So you have these organizations that are representing you, kind of like our chiefs. But these organizations aren't doing what their mandate is. They're not fulfilling the mandate. So, I mean, for every organization like CIJR that actually does stuff, you have 3 or 4 that say they do stuff and do nothing. So you end up with these people that are donating money on the idea that, okay, I've supported my cause. I've given them money to do the work on my behalf. Because the other thing about the Jewish community, and this is something that I really actually respect about you, is you guys don't mess around. You guys are out in the community doing community work. You all have very good jobs. You're educated. Like, these are things that are indicative of the Jewish community, right? You're successful because you work hard. It's not like somebody gave you a bunch of stuff. You earned it. But by the same token, I think sometimes the Jewish community gets a little too wrapped up in that, and then they forget that there's an outside world. And part of that world is what we're going through right now on campus. Now, the problem with the Jewish students, and I know this for a fact because I have some very good Jewish friends that have kids that are in university in Calgary, and I've helped them set up a university group called Calgary United for Israel. They tend to just want to be in school, get good grades, get the hell out of there, get in the workforce, be successful. That's their imperative. And they're very tunnel vision. They're very, I'm not going to get involved in student government. I'm not going to do that. I just need to get good grades and get out of here. And they work really hard. They get their good grades and they leave, right? The problem is that the other side doesn't give a shit about that. They have people that are in their 8th year of a 4-year degree, right? And you're laughing, but the truth of the matter is, I was at a debate, and my opponent was introduced as Wissam Cooley in the 7th year of his political science degree. So the very first thing I referenced, of course, was, isn't that a 4-year degree? Like, but that's the thing. The other side is fully willing to do that. We spend, I believe the stats show, 10 times more money on pro-Israel advocacy. Now, the reason I put the quotes on it, we're not spending it on pro-Israel advocacy. We're spending it on certain organizations to have people that are paid, so paid positions. We're spending, and it's not frontline, and that's really important to understand as well. We're spending this immense amount of money for upper management, for people that never do anything in the community. Those will never be somebody that you'll see speaking to kids unless it's a You know, they're brought in by like CIJR or somebody, right? Those people are not frontline advocates, but that's where we spend the money. We're not spending the money on, you know, effective advocacy. We're not spending it on posters. We're not spending it on people going to the campuses. Where the other side, they'll spend a shit ton of money on that. Stephen Salaida was getting paid an immense amount of money to tour all over Canada and the United States. And his raison d'etre, like what he does, is he goes around perpetuating exactly what I'm speaking up against. He tells people Palestinians are like natives and the Jews are like white colonizers. He wrote a book called Israel's Dead Soul. And that book, it's not an academic book, but it's quoted. It's actually quoted by native studies professors all over the United States and Canada. Now I'm going to say something that's going to scare you. Do you guys have any idea why? Why that book that is not academic at all is actually cited and sourced in these classes? It's because native studies professors all over Canada and the United States, there's a pile of them are Arabs. And now the scariest part, the ones that are there don't have degrees in history. So they're teaching native history to students that think they're going to learn about native history. They have no qualifications to be doing it. A lot of them have stuff like, one of them is Robert Warrior. He has a degree in consciousness studies. What the hell is consciousness studies? Like, I've heard some pretty ridiculous things in my day, but that's an actual degree. I'm sorry. Like, there's another guy, like Stephen Salaida. He has a degree in English literature. And he's teaching Native American studies. He was actually dehired by the University of Illinois. That's the guy that made the ridiculous tweets. Yeah. And by the way, somebody made the comparison of me to Salaida because I was attacking Hamas in my tweets, and that was apparently the reason they canceled my talk at McGill. But the truth of the matter is, he was tweeting stuff like anti-Semit, or what is it again? Zionism excusing making anti-Semitism honorable since the creation of Israel. So he's basically telling people that being anti-Semitic is honorable because Israel. Like this is the kind of stuff this guy was perpetuating. And this is a guy now that is being lauded by that side. And he's traveling around talking to people. I went to his talk in Edmonton. I handed out pamphlets that debunked a lot of the things in his book because worst hour and a half I've ever spent in my life reading his book. It was total waste. I'd have been better off spending it in the bathroom. Like, it was just terrible. So I read his book. I took his main points and I just blew them up because they're not truthful. I handed out these pamphlets and then I went and sat. And I sat through his ridiculous talk for the first hour. And then they had a question period. I walked down to the mic and stood at the mic with like 3 people behind me waiting to ask questions, but there were 2 mics. And they saw me and they started asking questions at the other mic and they wouldn't come back to my mic. So near the end of it, and then there was 15 minutes left, and they said, well, we don't have any more time today, so, you know, make sure to come to his next talk. It's over at this other building. So I started laughing, and I said, so much for academic freedom, because that's his big push word is academic freedom. So I left. I went to the next talk, and at the next talk, he was at the front, and it was really funny, because he's actually a fairly engaging person. He's a terrible speaker, though, and his writing, to be honest, is about 3rd grade level. It's really kind of embarrassing, but he's lauded by them as such an academic. So he starts his talk by saying, I'm not a confrontational person. And he starts bringing the tone of his voice down, and he's being very quiet, so everybody has to lean forward to listen. And then he says, I'm so unconfrontational that I have a 2-year-old son, and I can't yell at him. I can't raise my voice. And he goes, so sometimes he makes me cry. And then everyone laughs and claps. And I'm sitting there looking at him, and I'm like, so full of crap. So I waited. And, you know, I was going to wait till the question period because I'm a Canadian. We're polite. And then he starts talking about how the Jews invented terrorism. And he's like, I'm just going to say this. He goes, Jews invented terrorism. And so, of course, everybody sits up and they're like, whoa, now he's being controversial. And so I'm sitting there listening, and then he goes, the Jews were the first people to start killing civilians, blah, blah, blah. Like, just patently retarded. Sorry, ridiculous. I got to quit using that word. And, yeah. So sorry, it's, you know, you grow up in the bush, sometimes you stay in the bush a little bit. So I kind of get a little bit annoyed, and I'm a fairly self-controlled person, but finally I lost a little bit of my self-control, and I raised my voice and I said, Hebron 1929. And he goes, what's that? I was kind of in shock. I was like, you know, when the Arabs killed every single Jew in the city of Hebron in 1929.
66 people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
66 people.
Yeah.
So, and he's like, he sits back, and it was really funny because I didn't realize at the time that some of these people know who I am. So he said, "You're Ryan Bellerose," and I was like, "Yep." I'm like, I'm not going to deny it. So he says to me, he says to everybody, he goes, "He's a paid agent for Stand With Us," and I was like, "Well, that's news to me." Like, I've never received any of those Zionist checks, like. So he started laughing, and he's like, "Yeah, he comes to all these events, and he tries to disrupt them." And I was like, "All of these events, I think I've been to 3, and not just him, like this other stuff that I've done." And so he starts yelling, and it was really funny because he starts yelling. He's like, "You try to deny my history, and you're trying to deny my identity." And I was like, "Well, because it's a false history and it's a stolen identity." And he looks at me, and like and it was funny because the people behind me started laughing, and like these are his supporters that were laughing. And then he's like, "Blah blah 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 blah," and I was like, Stephen, at the very start of your talk, I said you said that we're on native land, because he was sucking up to everybody. He's like, "I just want to acknowledge that we're on Indian land, and this is the tribe," and he named off like 5 or 6 tribes. None of them were actually the people from the area that he's in. So yeah, it was ridiculous. Like, he's naming off all of these native tribes, and I actually went to high school in Edmonton, so I know whose land it is. And then he really screwed up because he's like, Métis land, and I'm like, okay, so pardon my language, but I'm like, you're a fucking idiot. Like, my people are from the Red River. We're not from Edmonton. Like, why would you even say that? That's offensive to the native people who are there, because now you're denying them. So I told him, I was like, and by the way, we're not on Métis land, Steve. I was like, that's in Manitoba, in Saskatchewan. You might want to do a little reading. And these girls behind me, they started laughing because like they realized how ridiculous it was. But then, the typical snap your fingers people, and they start snapping their fingers. And the one girl goes, "We brought Steven here to speak, and blah blah blah, and now you're ruining our event." And I turn around, and I'm like, I feel really terrible about that. And I was like, I feel so bad, I don't even really know what to say. And I was like, I guess maybe I'll go. And so I turn around, start packing up my stuff, and then I realize a bunch of them have their cameras out, and they're sticking their cameras in my face, right? So I turned, and I made sure and said into each camera, because I knew this way they wouldn't put it online, I said, "Arab conquest, 7th century, Google it." That's simple. It's just a simple argument. I don't have to make a 15-minute diatribe. I just have to say, Arab conquest, 7th century, Google it. And I actually saw, as I was walking out, one guy had his Google on his phone. And he was typing. And I, of course, because I'm me, I saw the Google symbol. That's the only reason I knew. So I leaned over to look, and he looks at me. And I was like, good call. And so as I walked out, security came walking over, and they started, typical, look at me, I'm a mall cop kind of deal. And so I told the one guy, I was like, "Is this really something you want to do?" Because he didn't really look like he really wanted to put his hands on me. And then the other guy put his hand on my arm. So I explained to him that, that constituted assault. And he's like, "What?" And I was like, "I'm moving towards the door. I'm clearly leaving. You put your hands on me. That's technically assault." And his buddy looks at him, like the other security guy, and he's like, "He's right." Right? And so he took his hand off my arm, and we continued to walk towards the door. And then the guy, for some reason, he did it again. Put his hand on my arm again. And then he stepped in front of me. And I'm like, "You realize that what you just did, you not only assaulted me, but now you're preventing me from leaving." And I was like, "By preventing me from leaving, that's actually unlawful confinement." And I was like, "And I'm well within my rights to defend myself. And I feel afraid. And I'm clearly afraid for my life." And I said it very calm. And the other guy goes, "Yeah, you should probably just let go of him and get out of his way, dude." And so he stood there for another second. And I'm like, okay. So I put my bag down. And as soon as I put my bag down, then he backed away. And I left. And it was funny because then there were police out front. And so they had called the police, and they called security. And so this is the kind of thing that they do. They don't want us to talk.
Can I interrupt?
Absolutely.
Maybe this question's relevant.
Sure.
Why did the talk that was scheduled for Monday afternoon at Concordia, why did it not take place?
Oh, it was actually Concordia and McGill.
All right, well, I'm only
Yeah,
the one
no,
at Concordia.
it was one talk, but it was the 2 groups that had organized
But
it.
it was
so-
taking place at
Yeah, but it was, I believe it was Montreal. It was,
Can we do it afterwards?
Yeah.
I think at this point we're into
One to
question
one.
and answers.
Sure.
Can I-
So let me
can I
just
answer
wrap
that
up.
question?
You want to wrap up?
Sure,
sure, I'll just wrap up and then I'll take, sure. Sorry about that. I'll answer that for sure though. So really, to end everything off, I just want maybe to make sure that everybody understands that in regards to the Israel advocacy, the reason I believe so firmly that I have something valuable to contribute is because what I've learned from Native advocacy in Canada is that if we're quiet and we try to do everything on the down low and we're not in their face and we're not using language that they understand, we'll be ignored. And if we continue to use these tactics where the non-advocacy is advocacy, every time we do that, the line moves a little bit more. It's simple bullying, and I really hope that you guys are understanding that these people are bullies. And what they'll do is they'll bully you and bully you and bully you, and if you don't stand up, they don't think to themselves, okay, well now we've accomplished what we needed to. They think, now I can do a little bit more. And that's exactly what we went through in the Native struggle. Like we had the media would literally go and select the person that they thought would be the most ignorant person. So they would pick people. It's literally, it's kind of like in TV in the States, you know, they have a tornado and they go to the trailer park and they find somebody that, you know, looks kind of humorous and they'll interview that person. It's exactly the same thing. They'll take somebody that really has no business being a spokesperson for anything and they'll interview them because they want to show how ridiculous we are. Instead of trying to find somebody like me or somebody like Jessica Gordon or Nina Wilson, people that are actually fairly eloquent, they would go and find the worst possible person for the interview. And I find that sadly, when it comes to our advocacy, a lot of times they'll go and look for people on the pro-Israel side that are ridiculous. They'll find somebody that, like somebody that's very extreme in their views. And then the funny part is then there's people like me that I don't think I'm very extreme. I think I'm pretty firm, but then I'm labeled an extremist because I think the Jews should be proud of themselves. I think that you have lots of things to be proud of, But somehow I got painted as an extremist. I'm a radical because I don't think that you should be apologetic. And I think that's kind of funny.
It's very funny. Yes.
But yeah, if there's anything to take away, that would be it. So yeah, I guess if there's any questions, but first I guess I should answer.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
First, we should
I should
clap our
answer.
hands for you.
Answer that.
Wonderful presentation. Wonderful.
I think you can see how extremely radical Brian is, and it's so understandable that Hillel, which is a Jewish advocacy organization, would bring him all the way to Montreal, pay the expenses, and cancel his talk.
Guys,
The absurdity of this, the absurdity of this is unbelievable.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Your scheduled appearance?
Yes. Okay. I don't want to get into too much of it. So I'll give everybody kind of a quick rundown, and it's not going to be overly productive to basically, get into a big fight with Hillel. But I'm not going to lie. I was pretty angry, and the reason I was angry is because they didn't just cancel it; they actually canceled it, and then they kind of, in my view, they smeared me a little bit. And
A little bit?
yeah. So basically what I was told was at 11 o'clock the night before my talk, I got a text, and in the text it just basically told me, some of your tweets have come to our attention. Those tweets were extremely offensive to some people, and they were anti-feminist, and there was a bunch of, typical university speak kind of stuff. And so I replied. At first I thought he was joking, because I was like, are you kidding? Like, that's not funny. And then he's like, no, I'm serious. So
This was a Hillel official?
the president of Hillel. So the student president,
Jeff Beecher?
Jonathan Mamey.
Or Jonathan
He
Mamey?
had his hands tied apparently.
Yeah. Later on in the text, he said, look, there's been some pressure from some other organizations, and this comes from higher up than me. Now, I want everybody to understand, too, because Jonathan is the guy that originally approached me and asked me to come. So he's the guy that actually spent the time to ask me to come here. He's the one that organized it all. And I'm a little bit irritated with him because I thought maybe he should have stood up for it a little bit stronger, but I don't know what happened behind closed doors. Maybe he did, but I do know that he was pressured very heavily.
He did.
Yeah, I figured he
I
would.
was told that he was very vocal in supporting you, and he got a lot of threats by the higher ups to remove him from his position because apparently he does not conform to his values, and he will make the Jewish community look bad. That was their concern.
Yeah. Sorry.
Higher ups means what?
Federation, the Federation mainly, the people that sponsor Hillel, so the Federation, there's CJA, CIJ, it's mostly CIJA because the CIJA has this advocacy strategy called let's
It's called Shah Still, I think.
Well, it's that, and it's more like we need to act like the better people. We need to be more mature, quiet, intellectual, reasonable, so that they look like screaming idiots next to us. But that just doesn't work anymore.
Doesn't work.
It's
For the record,
Sorry.
for the record,
Yeah.
I sent a media query to CIJR, and I asked if they had some part in the cancellation. They denied if they had any part whatsoever, or even do anything about it. For the
Yeah.
record.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah,
Really?
we have to verify
Sorry,
facts.
I'll just go in order.
Yeah.
Who
My
could
name
it
is
be?
Bracha. I came late, I'm sorry. I don't know if you said something what I'm going to ask.
Sure.
When you go to Israel, who do you meet there? I mean, which groups do you associate with?
Okay, so it's actually, I'm really glad you brought that up. So I met with all kinds of people. I met with,
Sure.
yep, I met with some Palestinians. I met with the Druze. I met with, I went to the Lehi Museum and I actually met some
Wait.
people. Lehi?
Lechi.
The Lechi,
Yeah.
Yeah.
the Etzel.
Yep.
Lehi.
I went to their museum.
Yeah,
Uh,
obviously.
and then I actually got to meet some of the people that were in Lehi. I wish I could remember her name. She gave me a sign. Yeah. I mean, I met with.
Because it's saying Etzel, it's not Etzel.
Yeah,
It's,
I got lucky enough to meet Michael Oren. I got to meet several people. It
Michael
was
Owen, that was the
the historian.
ambassador?
Yeah, the ambassador. I thought I knew him as a historian. I didn't know he was the ambassador at the time. So
But no, what I meant is really, do you meet any group,
No, it was because
political groups?
no, I haven't yet.
That's what I really
Yeah.
wanted to know.
Yeah, people are asking who sponsored your trip to.
Oh, sorry. So stand with us. It's actually kind of a cool story because I wrote an article, and then a friend of mine just sent it to this lady that I'd never met. Her name's Roz Rothstein. She's the founder and CEO of Stand With Us. So while I was in San Francisco at a friend's house, she messaged me and she said, "I heard you're in California. Did you want to come and meet me?" And to be honest, she's been one of my heroes because she started an advocacy group, a grassroots group, in the living room of her house, and it's become Stand With Us, which is one of the largest pro-Israel groups in the world, right? So she's literally like a hero. So I was a little bit of a fanboy, right? I was like, yeah, like of course. So I paid for a flight myself to Los Angeles, and I went to her house and met her. And now I'm taking a group of Native activists to Israel next year, or this year. I keep saying next year because it's coming so close. But so I was fundraising for that, and I was trying to figure out itineraries and stuff. And I went to her house, and I figured I was going to be selling her on this idea because I think it's a valuable idea. I think it's really important to take Native people there because once they see what now that I can say it, now they see what I saw, and they'll come back and they'll be they're more likely to stand up for Israel, right? So I sit down at her table and she goes, "Okay, before you even say another word, you need to go to Israel." And I was like, "Yeah, that's what I'm here to talk about." Didn't really know what to say. And she goes, "No, I'm saying you need to go to Israel and you need to go right away." And I was like, "Okay." And she goes, "What are you doing this summer?" And unfortunately, I had already committed to playing football that year. So I told her, I said, "Well, I play football in the summertime, and it's difficult for me to go anywhere because we have games every weekend." And she says, "Okay, well, what are you doing next month?" And this was in April. And I was like, nothing. I didn't really know what to say. And she goes, "Can you go to Israel for a couple weeks?" And I was like, "Yeah, but I can't really afford to do that. I'm putting all my money to this trip." And she's like, "No, we're going to send you." And I was in shock. I was like, "Why?" It's kind of when somebody offers you something that's so amazing, it's like, really? What's the catch? And she said, "No, you don't have to do anything." She goes, "We just want to send you." She said, kind of to say thanks for all the stuff you do. And it was amazing. So I gave them my bucket list. The girl from Jerusalem, Chevy Cass, emailed me, said, "What's on your bucket list to see in Israel?" And I think I kind of took her aback a little bit because it took me about 5 minutes. I just wrote the 20 things I really wanted to do, and all the museums and Caesarea, stuff like that. I sent it to her, and every single thing on the list. So there were 20 things. The only thing I didn't get to do was go scuba diving in Eilat. That was the only, and I'm totally okay with that.
Save that for your honeymoon.
When
Yeah.
when was this trip?
That was last year in May.
And that was your first and only trip to Israel?
Yeah.
Yes, over here. Go ahead, yes. Could you give us your name, please, when you ask?
If we wanted to get in touch with you.
Yeah.
And
Terry
we're not on
Spiegel.
Facebook.
Spiegel.
Yeah.
to
How do we
speak.
get in touch with you? We wanted to
Sure.
send you something that was interesting or.
Oh, okay, so we have a website. It's called QE.ca.
Hold on, I want to write this down. It's called what?
QE,
CUWI.
CUWI.ca.
CUWI.
WI.
It's like the
Yeah.
gold mines.
Calgary United Country.
Yeah. Now the other thing is too,
.ca.
yeah, .ca. That website actually, just so everybody knows, we do put a lot of documentation up on the website. We put pamphlets for people because we believe that one thing that we do really well as pro-Israel advocates is network. And so if there's a student group that's fighting somebody like Stephen Salaida or Miko Peled, we put together pamphlets that debunk their talks. And I mean, we actually use you guys as a source sometimes. So there's a lot of it. They're usually like we make sure that they're very well researched and it's stuff that you can share. I'm 40. Yeah, I know I look younger, but it's
You have children, so you're not worried about your family or anything like that?
no. You know what? That's what I always joke around about. It's like it's just me. So what are they gonna do?
Yeah, we should.
So you were involved in this thing that happened with the demonstration against Hamas, I think it was last summer?
Yeah,
Those are friends of yours.
Yeah.
those are actually very good personal friends of mine. The Hamilton family.
Who spoke here?
What's that?
She spoke.
Yeah, Sammy came here.
Sarah and Sam, yeah.
Sarah and Sam. So.
And like the mayor of Calgary,
Okay, so I'll you know what, I think if there might be a few questions about it, so what I'll do is I'll just try to answer them all real quick. The Hamilton family got attacked in Calgary, and basically the week before I was down at across the street, and I was wearing an IDF shirt, and I had an Israeli flag, and about 20 people came across the street, and I was there talking to some Muslim girls. I wrote a blog about it right afterwards, because I didn't want to forget any of the details, because it was interesting. These girls came over and they asked me some questions about Israel, and I explained to them, calmly. I talked to them about the indigenous aspect of the whole conflict, and it was interesting because they were actually interested in listening, and we stood there and talked for about an hour and a half, and then about 20 guys came over, and actually I recognized some of them as being involved in the attack the next week. They came over and they started trying to get up in my chest, and they were beaking off. And the one guy came up really close to me, and I just told him, because he reached out like he was going to grab my Israeli flag, and I told him, I'm like, if you touch me, that's assault. And then he's like, so? And I was like, well, if you assault me, I'm probably going to assault you. I made it very clear. And there was a police officer about 20 feet away. And then a bunch of his friends, they were all standing close together, and he moved up a little bit closer. And I'm like, I feel like you're trying to threaten me. And he's like, kind of talking, I don't know what he was saying. He was saying something in Arabic. And then I told him, okay, well, I guess we're going to have a fight. And then he backed up. Right? What happened, though, was the next week, the Hamiltons were supposed to come to my house for a barbecue. And we had a friend of ours, his name's Adam, he's in the IDF, and he was home on leave, so I decided to have a barbecue on Friday night. And they're reform, so it's not, easy way to say. So they, everybody was all at the house already, except for the Hamilton family and a couple people that were with them. So we're cooking, and I get a phone call from my friend Sarah, and she said, okay, well, we're all just going to stop at this protest at City Hall, and just, we're just going to walk over and look at it and show our Israeli support and then leave. And I said, okay, I don't know if that's really a great idea, because, none of them are really large people. So I was like, make sure you take a camera and film it. And I was very clear on that, because what had happened to me the week before, I was really kind of upset with myself that I didn't film it. So basically what happened was they got out of the car, they parked, they walked they were literally out of the car for about 2 minutes. Earlier in like probably about 5 minutes earlier, there were a couple Christian guys, and this is the part of the story that everybody screws up, because they get the numbers wrong and they get the timeline wrong. Jeff Willerton and Merle Tuleski, they're these two Christian guys in Calgary, and they're pro-Israel. They're kind of a little bit wingnutty, but their heart's in the right place. They were standing on the same side as the protesters, holding a flag. And that's the video that everybody sees where they rip the guy's flag away, and then he tries to get his flag back, and then he punches him and pushes him to the ground. That's Jeff. So that happened right as Jim and Marcy got out of the car. Now they walk up, and then you see them by the steakhouse, which is across the street. All these people that did this see them and immediately cross the street. There was no hesitation. So these people all cross the street. They go over to the Hamiltons. They start yelling and screaming, and on the video you can see they're waving their flag and purposely trying to hit Shane in the face with the flag. Like, you can see this. This is not me editorializing. How the fight started was one of them pushed Shane and grabbed his shirt and ripped it. He had a shirt that said Mossad, it's never an accident. So he, yeah, I thought that was awesome actually. So he rips his shirt, and so of course Shane's a pretty big kid. He pushes the guy away, and then that's how the melee started. So then they had, you know, Sam, who's like what 22 years old, gets pushed to the ground. A guy tries to jump on her head. In the background, there's people yelling, "Kill the Jews!" And now, I'm not saying this to make you guys all get outraged. What I'm telling you is, like, this is what happened. And then, after all of this, like, the other, Marcy got punched in the stomach. You know, Jake Burrell got choked by the flag that he had tied around his neck. Jake's their nephew. There were 7 people, not 15. That's a family of 6, and they had one family friend with them. So, in the media, they talked about how there were 15 pro-Israeli government supporters. They didn't say any of these people are just pro-Israel. I'm pretty sure that Jim doesn't give a shit who the government of Israel is. He's just pro-Israel. You know, that's how it is. And then we sat in court, which was, I believe, last week. And I'm sitting in court, and I'm listening to the prosecutor basically talk like he's the defense lawyer. What did he say again? It was an escalation of hostilities. So there was never a mention of the fact that this was actually a mob attack. The defense were the only people that actually mentioned that there were several people involved on an attack against a few people. The defense attorney actually said, how did he say it again? It was really kind of funny. He was trying to excuse the 3 people. So he said, the injuries that were suffered by the Hamiltons, we can't guarantee that it was just these 3 gentlemen because so many people were involved in the attack. And instead of, you know, as a prosecutor, you'd think, okay, excellent, now that opens the door and I can say this is a mob attack. No mention of it. And then the worst part of the whole situation was the prosecutor, I don't believe, was very well prepared. He didn't know any of the facts. He didn't know who had organized the riot, because it was a riot. He didn't know that it was SPHR, a student group from the university. He didn't know that they had been talking about being violent towards Zionists on their Facebook page. None of this stuff was mentioned. And in the media, none of this stuff was actually put forth until one guy actually posted it. So,
And it wasn't called a hate crime.
no, and that's, you know what, that's the most ridiculous part of this whole thing, is that these people were clearly attacked for a specific reason. And if you look at the Canadian law actually states very clearly that if you attack somebody because of their ideology, their religion, or their personal beliefs, that's a hate crime. This was never even, hate crime was never even mentioned.
Punishment was homework, as I understand.
The punishment was a $300, $400, and $500 fine, 12 months probation. Now here's the best part. The judge had to add that. They had to write an essay on the Canadian Charter of Values and Freedoms. Now, the sad part was the judge was actually trying to push for them to go for some sort of educational component. She kept telling the prosecutor, you know, what's going to actually teach these guys? Like, these guys are, they came from somewhere else. They don't understand, and we need to make sure, like, is there some kind of course? Like, you need to look into that. And he kept saying, I don't know. We need to talk to probation. And then the best part was the judge once actually interrupted him and said, do you need a little bit more time?
Oh, that's a red light.
Yeah. And when a judge, I'm thinking as a prosecutor, sorry, I'm just going to turn this off. I'm thinking as a prosecutor, if the judge says, do you need a little bit more time? I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to say, yes, absolutely, can I have a little bit more time? The prosecutor said, can I have 5 minutes? And she looked at him, and I've never seen this, and I've sat through a lot of trials watching. She said to him, I don't know what you're going to accomplish in 5 minutes, but okay. Like, she was clearly giving him an opportunity, and he didn't take it. So I just feel that the prosecution was not adequate.
Do you think he was lazy or were his hands tied?
Maybe a little A, a little B. Maybe a little bit of ineptness, I don't know.
Question over here, please.
I teach Israel advocacy.
Name, please, your name.
Howie Silverger. I teach Israel advocacy at a local Jewish high school.
Okay.
To the graduating class, the class that's going into college. When I talk to the class, and I ask them, when we go over some of the stuff that's happening on campus and how to react to some of the stuff, when do you react, when don't you react, because sometimes it's better not to react as soon as things are on the moment, and to react later. When we go over that, the biggest question asked is, why don't we just walk away? What's the difference? Who cares?
Okay.
So why do we have to stand there and fight with them?
Yeah.
Why can't we just walk away?
Okay, so there's a really simple answer for that. Because if you walk away, they win. It's like a bully. As normal, rational people, we are always taught, don't be violent, don't fight.
Ignore them.
Yeah, just walk away. And it's as a kid, I was always taught, Walk away and you're the bigger man. Now, empirical evidence that I learned through going through school and being a normal human being is that when you walk away, then everybody thinks that now, okay, I can pick on that guy too.
Yeah.
Because the truth of the matter is, by walking away, you're not the bigger man. The truth of the matter, yeah, you're a coward. And I know it's horrible, and we don't like to hear it because we live in a society where everybody thinks, oh, you know, fighting is not the way to answer anything. Use your words. Well, I do use my words. But I learned in high school very, very quickly that the first day of school, a guy walked up to me and picked a fight with me. Now, my mother had just passed away, and I wasn't really feeling like beating somebody up. So I just looked at him, shook my head, and turned and walked away. The next day I went to school, 2 guys picked a fight with me. And I'm not joking. They must have thought, okay, I can make a reputation by picking on the big guy. He'll walk away, and I look like a tough guy, right? So the second day, I kind of, you know, I maybe did things a little bit differently. And after that, people tended to leave me alone. But unfortunately, we have this idea that walking away is the way to deal with things. Walking away is not the way to deal with things. You have to confront it. When it's a bully, if a bully gets in your face and starts to bully you, you punch him in the face. My dad has a really, really, really good saying, and it sounds a little bit rough, but it's true. Common courtesy is better than a broken fucking nose. Yeah?
What do you say to people who, I know that, you know, I mean, these arguments can get down to, I see the comments online. I noticed after my article today, like, you know, one guy was saying, oh, this tribalism is just ridiculous. You know, everybody's got their little tribe, and it was sort of making fun of anybody that talks about their people, their tribes. And then there's another guy who said, well, the Jews aren't indigenous to Israel because they eradicated tribes that were already there, or people that were already there.
The
Yeah.
Canaanites.
Get that.
I've heard that before.
Okay. So there's actually 2 really good questions there. So the first one is, what do I say to people that kind of mock tribalism? That's because they've lost who they are, right? If you don't have a strong vision of who you are and who your people are, I can't reach those people because they've already lost who they are. They think that we're all the same. And here's the thing. In certain levels, we are. At certain levels, we're all human beings, right? But unfortunately, there are divisions. And sometimes those divisions are not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes those divisions mean it's something like the Jewish people. I mean, you were in a diaspora, you were exiled, but you maintained a coherent nation of people. And it's important that you did that because you didn't lose who you were. And then when you were able to return to your ancestral land, you still had your coherent nation. That's never, like if you read history, that's never happened anywhere, ever. So I would say that I would argue that tribalism is not necessarily a negative thing. Now, the second question is, sorry, could you repeat the second question? I just want to make sure I have it
Well,
right.
people say, oh, you can't be indigenous because,
Because
there
you
were people
conquered
there,
Canaanites.
There were people there when
Yeah.
the Jews arrived.
Kicked out the
Okay.
Canaanites.
Yeah, so that's a really easy one, actually,
Yeah, it's an easy one.
because long-standing presence is not the sole signifier of indigenous status. And I'm very clear, there's one key word. So when you talk to people about indigenous status, you don't gain indigenous status through conquering, ever. You can't. That's not how you gain indigenous status. Indigenous status isn't even really gained. Indigenous status just is. So if you've had a genesis of culture, you've had a genesis of tradition on an ancestral land, you're an indigenous person. And it's important that you understand too, you also have those ties. So the Canaanites, in point of fact, now I don't want to offend religious people, but the Jewish people didn't eradicate the Canaanites. They subsumed them. So they basically incorporated them into their people, right? So there is a blood tie there, but that's not the sole signifier either. Blood quantum is actually a white term. It's something that colonizers came up with.
Nor was Yasser Arafat a Canaanite.
Well, exactly. If we really want to get specific, and this is because we like to have arguments against the whole Palestinian indigenous question. It's really simple. They're Arabs. Arabs are indigenous to a different region. They're an indigenous people to the Hijaz, which is the Arabian Peninsula. And if they want to self-identify as Arabs, that's totally okay. But then you don't get to self-identify as an Arab and claim somebody else's ancestral homeland. I'm Métis. I'm from a very specific region. I'm from the Red River. That's where my people are from. That's where I'm indigenous to. I don't get to go to British Columbia and claim to be indigenous to British Columbia. It's still in Canada. They're both still close. They're fairly close together. But that's not my land. And I would never claim it. So for somebody from British Columbia to come over and try to claim where I'm from, I would find that offensive too. Arabs, Israel, same thing.
I always hear the argument from people, and this is the hardest argument to fight I heard, and it's because it's so stupid, but it's also like so widely used. They say, but you know, the Arabs were Jews too. They were not the Arabs. The Palestinians were Jews too. They were just forced to convert.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a simple.
They're the closest genetically to Ashkenazi Jews. Blah blah
Absolutely.
blah blah blah.
But Alex, that's a super easy argument to destroy. Yeah. And I hear it all the time too. So, and I'll give you the easiest counter for that one.
Yeah.
I look like I'm white, right? Now I look like an Indian. Now I look like I'm white. So right now I look like I'm white. I can get away. I can pass for being white. And a lot of Jewish people have this exact same blonde hair, light colored eyes. There you go. So you can pass. But the difference is, and it's a very integral difference, is even if we carry the blood, that doesn't automatically make us Indigenous. If I started self-identifying as a white person, so I came to you guys and said, you know, my mom's Norwegian. I'm going to say that I'm Norwegian. I'm just Norwegian. Probably, maybe I can get away with it. If I stay out of the sun for long enough, definitely I can get away with it. But I'm not Norwegian. And if it's examined carefully, I'm not Norwegian. Now, the Palestinians, they'll claim, well, I have Jewish blood, so I have just as much right to this as you do. It's like, okay, but you now self-identify as the conqueror, colonizer people. You're now taking the mantle of the conqueror. You're telling people, I am the dominant sector of this society. Because the Arabs, as much as they like to pretend that they're the underdog, they are the dominant. In the Middle East, Israel's less than 1% of the landmass. So they are, in fact, dominant. And the whole region, they're dominant. They're the dominant people.
In North Africa, too.
Yeah, exactly. So when they tell people that I'm Arab, they don't get to come back and say, I'm Arab, but I have a little bit of Jewish blood way back in the day, so now I'm Indigenous. That's not how it works. If I was to tell everybody that I'm white and then come back and say, but I'm an Indigenous person, but I'm white, my people would laugh at me. They'd be like, okay, well, you've identified as white now. You're not one of us anymore. You can't, by the same token that I always say you cannot take Indigenous status from us, you can't grant it either. So I have to give it up. Like if I didn't want to be an Indigenous person, I could very easily just integrate, I could assimilate and just be white. But then I wouldn't be an Indigenous person anymore. That's my personal belief. I mean, there are some people that argue it, but I think that's a fairly logical position.
What's been the reaction of other indigenous people, the Native, everything you're doing? Do you feel that they, once informed about the realities of this, that they feel they have something to learn from you, from
Yeah. So it runs a spectrum, right? Because you guys, the one thing that's really important for everyone to remember is that the social justice movement is the most involved movement in Native rights, right? So, and that movement just happens to be pretty much run by a lot of lefties, like a lot of very hard left people. Being left doesn't really mean what it used to be, right? Like in the 1960s, that meant you were somebody that was very concerned about civil rights, you were concerned about human rights, you were very, I wouldn't say bleeding heart, that's kind of been more the normal now. Back in those days, it actually meant that you were willing to do something about it. You guys were the guys, you know better than me. I mean, civil rights movements, there were Jewish people involved in all of them. So now, though, we have a very specific group of people that are involved in those kinds of struggles. And it was actually to my benefit that I didn't know that when I got involved, because I might not have gotten involved, right? I wouldn't have started doing any of this stuff, even for my own people. If I would have known then what I know now, I probably would have been like, I don't want to be, these people are crazy, right? Native people tend to just be really involved in our own struggles because they're very encompassing. Like it's very difficult for us to actually even get involved in anybody else's struggles because we have so many issues of our own. So it's very, it's such a good question that this is something I could probably give a whole talk on because it runs the gamut. There are people that have called me that I didn't really think would be supportive, and they're excited about it. They're like, wow, I never really saw it that way, and then I read your article and I did some Googling, and you're right, like those people are just like us. And then there's the people, and actually I sent an article to Nathan, a friend of mine actually, that was an actual conversation where he said, like, why do you support the Jews? They're bad. And I was literally like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, because I was kind of like, how can you read anything that I write and still think Jews are bad people? And he's like, no, they're bad. They killed Jesus. and then the way I got to him though, I said to him, I said, so you're telling me the Jews are bad? I was like, who told you the Jews are bad? And he's like, well, the priest. And I said, okay, so the same guy that told you that you're bad because you're brown and you speak another language, and he tells you the Jews are bad and you're going to believe him about that, but you don't believe him about the other thing? Like, do you think that's a little bit illogical, maybe? And he thought about it for a little while. Like, there was a you know, because we argued a lot on Facebook because he pissed me off. And then finally he came back, and afterwards, now he's on Facebook again, and he's been posting, and it's really funny. If you go read his timeline, it's Roger commented, and it's all these articles about Israel. And he actually writes, like, you know, I don't think that those guys should be, you know, talking like that to the Jews, and they have a right to self-defense. He totally changed his perception because he realized that who was teaching him? It's not so much what he was taught. It was who was teaching him. Do they really have any legitimacy if they tell us that we're evil, and we know we're not evil in our heart, and then all of a sudden you're like, okay, it's some dumbass telling me that these people are evil. Totally changed his perception. And then we have, then I'm not going to lie, then we have the hardcore left social justice people. And the sad part about that is that a lot of them are extremely decent people. They just really believe in their heart that they're doing the right thing. They just have really bad information. And they believe the bad information. I mean, we also have to understand, 40 years of an entrenched narrative. It's been 40 years that these people like Edward Said have been perpetuating this bullshit. That's right. And, okay, it is bullshit.
And it's taught.
Just let me say, it's been 40 years and more,
Yeah.
which a segment of the Jewish community has been left-wing.
Yeah.
More than
And we see that in many different ways among students, among members of the community. It's part of the problem that
Absolutely.
you and we are facing.
Yeah. And it's funny because I used that word bullshit, and that was one of the things that Hillel was really upset about. They're like, that's really confrontational language. Well, of course it's confrontational. You're trying to feed me bullshit. You know, like, I'm not a mushroom. You don't put me in the dark and feed me bullshit. That's not how it works. Every single person at this table is here today, I think, because we agree on one thing, and that's that the right of the Jewish people is important, to have self-determination on their ancestral land. That's an important thing. And if we let that be delegitimized, then we're letting them delegitimize all indigenous rights. And by doing that, they delegitimize all human rights.
And just one question before everybody leaves. It's probably the best pro-Israel advocacy lecture I've heard in a long time.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, how can we manufacture more Rhine Belleroses among ourselves, among the Jewish people?
I don't know.
That's my question, because unfortunately, and I said because we don't talk to non-Jews this way, but among ourselves, we say we don't have people that have the courage and the, I mean, the intellectual ability, yes, but not the courage that you have to go and advocate in a way that it should be advocated.
But
That's the
We're
thing.
we're taking some native people to Israel in April, and I
Right.
really firmly hope, like, so a lot of the
Can
missions
you take
they
us to some
take-
Jewish people, maybe?
We are.
So
actually.
that's it.
So here's the
This would
thing.
help.
We're taking 12 people in total.
Right.
And 8 of them are people that are very involved in the native activism community.
Right.
Like, and they're very well respected. So that gives them two advantages. People won't insult them or bash them. They won't try to bully them because they know that these people, you start trying to bully them, you'll alienate the entire native population.
Right.
And we're also taking some young Jewish people from the community. And the reason we're taking them is because I want to build lasting relationships. I want them to have a cooperative relationship and friendship, because truth be told, that's where you change things.
Excellent.
When you say we,
Calgary United with Israel.
You know, it was Israel.
We're organizing the trip right now. We're just fundraising.
And by the way, we could use some funds to help
and I want
support
to tell you
that.
something.
We're also
I
starting
was in
this
the
group
Excel.
called Montreal
You know
United
the
with
Excel?
Israel.
Yeah.
It's on Facebook.
Can I shake your hand?
Search it, Montreal United with
wanna give you
Israel.
this
We all started it.
Thank you.
I was in
So
the Excel
get
when
all
I
the
was 13
updates on what's
years
going on in the
old. I
community,
started.
you know, in the Israel activist
So
community,
listening
and you
to
can learn
you,
how you can help us
I
out
was late
and
today
support Israel
to make phone
publicly.
call to
And,
Israel
yeah.
as a result of this.
Along the same line, it's good.
Was there
Well, we
any-
basically copied them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very
We're
much.
like a branch of QE.
was there a comment?
Yeah.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Yes.
Everybody, please.
Sorry.
Hello.
Sorry, I'll talk to you after for sure.
Hello,
Yeah,
Yosef,
a few more
please.
minutes and that's it.
We're not finished.
Yeah, thank you for a very good talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think you have a lot of, just one small comment, that you have a lot of power in what you say because you are recognized as Indigenous as well. So like your point that Jews don't feel that they are Indigenous, it's we're delegitimizing ourselves. Right? And I just had a question about your vision for your own Indigenous people. Like if you have something that you would want to accomplish in your own community? Because you
Absolutely.
said you keep the Jews and that success
Yeah.
winning.
Yeah.
So what is your vision?
Well, you see, that's such a complex question.
Yeah.
Like you're killing me here. Okay, so for me, what I did was I prepared, and it's funny because I started this idea after I went to you guys all know what Chabad is, right?
Yeah, sure.
So we don't have anything like that. And I think that a large part of the cultural resurgence of Jewish people has been groups like Chabad, where they teach these kids, they can go on a Friday night and they can learn a little bit about their traditions, and it helps them reconnect with who they are. So we're doing something similar. We're trying to raise money for what we call Safe Place. So it's supposed to be a house on the res where kids can go, they can have a meal, and they get help with homework, stuff like that. But more importantly, they'll have somebody to teach them a little bit about their traditions. Our communities are pretty damaged. So we need to rebuild our communities. We need to get more respect for our women. That's a big one. I think that's why I got so irritated with Hillel. They made a comment that I was anti-woman and not. It was disturbing because I advocate actually that the Indigenous rights movement needs to be led by women, and the reason it needs to be led by women is really simple. They're the most marginalized and oppressed people, and if we take them and put them back in a position of power and a position of leadership, we're basically showing that we're ready to move forward, right? And we need to rebuild our communities. We need to get a lot more involved. I think that Native people need to start voting. We need to be more involved in our communities, not just Native communities either. I mean, I coach little kid football. I coach children's sports all the time. It's just something I do because it kept me out of jail, right? So I think that we need to give back to the community and do things like that. It's really important for us to start by rebuilding our communities, and then we can rebuild our nation. If we tried to do what you guys did right now, and I'm not talking about having a revolt. Everyone thinks that when I reference Israel, I mean, oh, we need to have a revolt and fight the white people. That's not it at all. What we need to do is we need to prevent ourselves from going the direction that the Jewish people were going before they had Israel. They were going to basically disappear in a couple more generations, and you would have had tiny little communities scattered here and there. That's what the direction we're going in with reserves, right? Like we're all hiding in these reserves. We're not out in the world, and we're not learning. We're not showing people who we are. Like we're literally a forgotten people. So we need to change that.
I was out of the room for a minute, so if the question was asked, just let me know.
Sure.
How are you regarded by your?
Oh, by my community?
It was asked?
Yeah. Me personally, actually, it's really funny because they try to delegitimize me a lot, and it happens quite often. Anybody that speaks up on behalf of Israel, they get told, well, your opinion doesn't matter, and you're not one of us, right? But they can't do that with me because my dad's fairly well known in the community. My father is Mervyn Bellerose. He wrote the Métis Proclamation. I've done things on my own in the Native community. Like I'm actually fairly well known just for my own work, not just for being Mervyn's kid. So sometimes this is how we can tell that the people that were criticizing me came from outside of our community. On the Idle No More Facebook page, I posted something, and it wasn't anything controversial. It was basically just, it was about Indigenous rights, but I did actually mention Israel. I think Israel came up only once in the whole article. But somebody wrote, oh, he's a Zionist, blah, 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 and he's not really an Indian. And it was funny because people from my community got really offended, and they said, who the hell are you to come to our community and tell us that, one of us isn't allowed to speak?
But amongst your own community, they back you? And
oh, yeah. Even the people who disagree with me, it's actually really funny. One of my close friends I grew up with in school, I tease her all the time. I say she's not very well educated because she's always arguing with me about the Jews, right? And she'll come right out and say, like, Ryan's one of us, and, he's part of our community. And if you want to criticize somebody in our community, you're going to alienate all of us. And she said, even if I don't agree with some of his premises, he's still one of us. And truth be told, I mean, some of the stuff that I say, you got to remember, again, fighting a 40-year entrenched narrative. Some people are very, very concerned that I'm saying things that don't mesh with what they've been taught. And they don't like it. So.
Yeah. So I have a couple little questions, actually. So first of all, I guess you could say that the Israelites and the Canaanites were each as indigenous to the land of Israel as, let's say, the Caribs and Arawaks were in the Caribbean, even though the Arawaks lived in one spot in the Caribbean before or after the Caribs, or let's say further north in North America, around present-day New York, up in New York State, the Iroquois and the Abenaki, for example, would be equally indigenous to a single spot, even though one people lived after the other, right? So,
Yeah, it's not a zero-sum game. Like the thing about being indigenous doesn't mean that if there's one indigenous people there can't be any others. Like okay, the other thing is important to understand with tribalist societies. A lot of times they're territorial, but those territories can sometimes overlap. Now they might not overlap a lot because when they do overlap, sometimes there's a little bit of conflict. But it doesn't necessarily follow that because there's one indigenous people here, there can't be another. What it does mean, though, is that we are very territorial. That's why this whole, I know that some of you have probably read about the Harsha Walia and that no borders bullshit. Well, we call it bullshit because it's not something natives would believe. We have a very firm grasp of what our territories are. And we don't like when somebody says, that's my land, if it's not. We don't, and the other thing is, too, it's important to understand, we don't look at land as ownership. We don't own the land. We belong to the land. So it's a deeper tie. It's not, well, this is my property. This is, I'm part of this land, right? So it's important to understand that these are concepts that are sometimes a little more difficult to explain to people that don't have that kind of background.
Yeah. Okay, and my other question is, what do you say that Arab Christians, including Maronites in Lebanon, like, are they more indigenous to the Levant region of the Middle East than the Arab Muslims are?
So that's actually a good question, and it's important that you asked it because my best friend is actually an Arab Maronite, but he's not an Arab. He'll tell you, it's really funny, in the last couple of years, they have come right out and said, we're Phoenicians.
That's true. The Copts too. They don't want to be called Arabs.
Exactly.
They
And now,
teach the Copts.
yeah, even in Israel.
Yeah.
And in
Don't like to be
Israel,
called Arabs.
yeah, in Israel, there's actually a movement now, and I think it's actually brilliant, and it's something that I fully support. They actually, there's a large segment of Arab Christians that said, no, we're not Arabs, we're Arameans. And we were Arameans before the Muslims came. We were Arameans before they forced us to take on the Arabic language. We're Arameans now. And the government of Israel has actually recognized that, which is really, really important because they're basically acknowledging the fact that there are indigenous peoples that were forced to become Arabized. And that's a hugely important step. Nobody else in the Middle East has taken that step yet. And I think it's huge because pretty soon you're going to see these resurgent movements all across the Middle East. You're going to see Circassians,
The best evidence now
Copts.
is what ISIS is doing in Iraq.
Yeah.
Massacring the Syrians,
the Yazidis, and the Kurds.
and all these people,
Yeah,
of course.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I just want to know where your thirst for knowledge came from. Did it start as a young child?
Yeah. Yeah, when I was...
From your parents, from school, from a...
So, the easiest way to explain is where I grew up, right? I grew up in a place, if you see it, it's very difficult to describe because it's beautiful, but it's really harsh. It's remote. There's not really a lot to do. Unless you're, you could hunt and fish. Yeah, growing up as a kid, I really liked it. So when you're a little kid, you love it. When you get to be about a teenager, not so much, right? So I grew up in a place like, the easiest way to explain it, it was a frontier. Like, we didn't have running water. We didn't have power. When I was 5 years old, my dad actually, he would work in lumber camps and construction work, and then he would come home with stuff. And one time he came home and he brought me a Encyclopedia Britannica. And so it would rain or it would snow. It would be too ugly to be outside. And I would sit inside and read. So
that's what started it.
That's absolutely what started it.
I mean, they don't even have those anymore.
Yeah,
That's
that's
what
it.
I grew up on.
That's right.
Encyclopedia Britannica.
Yeah.
It's really wonderful.
Yeah. So
Now you just...
Encyclopedia.
Today you have an
yeah,
iPhone.
now you have Google. Yeah.
Learns.
Yeah. But yeah, it's,
I think, are there any more questions? Are there any more, it's been a remarkable discussion here, and I'd like to make a point. This, it's running through my mind as Brian is talking. Zionism, right? Brian is a Zionist. We are Zionists. What does it mean, essentially? We believe in the right of the Jewish people to its land, and in the right of the Jewish people to take certain political measures in order to secure and maintain that land. We're having the seminar today after a great exercise in Zionism has just occurred, in which a truly Zionist movement has been affirmed in the land of Israel, in the face of international attempts to delegitimize it, to oppose it, coming from America, coming from Europe, coming from inside the state as well. And we have all to be conscious of what's going on here. that victory of Netanyahu comes because the people of Israel understand the absolutely overriding centrality of the security issue in facing the Iranian nuclear weapon and the Iranian genocidal threat to Israel. And that affects all of us. And we have to confront that. But what's running through my mind is how what a lousy job we do in our own bailiwick, where on a campus we can't confront this ragtime army of, idiotic Palestinian, pro-Palestinian activists and their hangers-on, and the crisis that represents for us. It's a crisis not only in the campus, because they delegitimize what we know to be true and what we love, and they affect other people who will go out off into the society and play roles which can be inimical to Israel. But they are also destroying, and the administrators at the institutions are helping through their weakness and opportunism. They're destroying one of the great bastions of true free speech,
Free exchange.
of true objective research, which is the university. So the struggle of Jewish students and their friends on campus is not only a struggle for Israel, but it's also a struggle for the university and for truth in the society. And when you talk about the notion of indigenousness, fighting for Israel is to defend the indigenousness and the human rights of all other peoples. It's the same kind of thing on campus, and people don't understand it. Okay, and perhaps this demonstrates to us the truth of political Zionism, of what Herzl taught, because where we have power today is not in diaspora. It's not in certain institutions which we have done as much as anyone else to build a university. It happens to be in the country where we have political sovereignty and the ability to defend ourselves with force when necessary.
Well, I believe.
I think we should all think about that.
To be honest, I believe that Zionism is an indigenous rights movement, because it's basically the right of self-determination on your ancestral land. It's that simple.
Absolutely.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.